Well, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our webinar this afternoon, jointly hosted by Blackboard Europe and our friends at Donor Voice. Thank you for giving up a few minutes of your time to join us. It's going to be interesting stuff, I have no doubt. So my name's Casper, I'm the Head of Marketing here at Blackboard Europe, and I'm delighted to be joined here today by Dr. Kiki Koutmeridou of fundraising consultancy Donor Voice, with whom many of you will be familiar, I have no doubt. A quick bit of housekeeping before we get started. There's several hundred of you listening in today, which is fantastic. For that reason, you're all muted, so we don't have any disturbance on the line. So if you do have a question, we welcome questions. That would be great. Just type it into the chat box, which you should be able to see in the corner of your screen. And Kiki's going to get to as many as she can at the end. Any questions that we don't have time to answer will be sent out in a follow-up email to everyone listening. And on that email, you'll also get all the slides and the recording of today's session so you can listen again or share it with any colleagues to whom you think it might be interesting. So all I'm going to do for the first minute is set the scene, and then I'm going to hand over to Kiki for the interesting stuff. So in case anyone's unclear exactly why donor consent is of such heightened importance right now, or to put it another way, in case anyone's been living under a rock for the last 6 months, what I'll do is provide the briefest possible summary, and then we'll move on to Kiki's stuff. So there is loads and loads and loads, obviously, that can be said on GDPR, and I will point to some useful resources at the end that you might want to check out. But I think for our purposes today, the salient points are as follows. So GDPR is obviously an EU law. It's replacing the Aging Data Protection Act, the DPA, and a date that I'm sure you will have circled in red on your calendars is May the 25th next year, which is when it comes into effect. If you're based in the UK, by the way, Brexit won't make any difference. GDPR is still going to apply. There was a little bit of debate around that, but be under no illusions, Brexit does not affect whether GDPR is going to affect you if you're in the UK. And as well as the legislative changes, which I'll come on to in a moment, GDPR's potential fines for breaching it are significantly higher than under DPA. None of this will be new to you, but obviously everyone is quite rightly concerned with getting it right. And lots is being talked particularly about consent and opt-in consent in particular. However, it's worth noting, as you can see on the screen there, there are still a total of 6 legal bases under which you can communicate directly with individuals or process individuals' personal data. And as you can see, they are the performance of a contract, compliance with legal obligation to protect the vital interests of a data subject, processing data if it's necessary for the performance of a task carried out in the public interest, and interestingly, legitimate interest still is on the list. However, number 6 there is the one that's getting the most column inches, which is the affirmative consent of the data subject in question. So that'll be the most significant of GDPR's impacts, no doubt, which is its overhaul of the requirements for collecting individuals' consent to you processing their data. I think it's fair to say, in practice today, data controllers, which all of you are as non-profits, often rely on an individual's, as it were, their failure to opt out of processing as evidence of their consent, or a close corollary of that, another popular method is using pre-ticked opt-in boxes at the point of collecting data. However, as I'm sure you're aware, GDPR is coming with an affirmative action requirement and explicitly states, and I quote, that silence, pre-ticked boxes or inactivity will not be adequate. In other words, consent under GDPR must, as it is today, still be freely given, specific and informed, but it must also, as of May the 25th next year, also be unambiguous. In other words, the individual must actively opt in. Now, no matter which legal basis you choose to use to justify processing data, and by which I mean principally communicating with donors or potential donors, and as I said, legitimate interest is still on the list, and which legal basis you choose will undoubtedly vary depending on lots of different factors, like your previous interactions with that individual. But no matter which route you go down, there is a lot you can control right now around how you ask for opt-in consent in order to ensure your future success post-May next year. And that is the real substance of the webinar today. It's what can you control now around how you ask for consent. That's hopefully a bit of context set. There's lots more that could be said, but I want to pass over to Kiki now for the really interesting stuff.
Thank you, Casper. And yeah, that's the really the key point in today's webinar, that it doesn't matter whether you decide to go for an opt-in consent statement or an opt-out legitimate interest. The difference is how you frame this ask. And we suggest you frame it with behavioral science principles that are known to affect choice. Now, there is a huge body of knowledge on the enormous number of factors influencing a supported decision to tick or not tick a box. And in Donor Voice, we did a review of this knowledge last summer in partnership with the Decision Making and Behavioral Economics Research Group at City University in London. And we identified the most effective factors likely to influence the decision to stick around. So we looked at the literature, and from numerous factors, we identified 6 that could be the most influential. You've all heard of social proof, the idea that people usually do what other people are doing. So we added that in the mix in our test, in our previous test. Social label is the idea that by calling someone something and using a noun, then people try to behave in accordance to that. So if I call someone generous, people might start behaving more generously just to prove the point. Commitment and consistency is all about reminding someone of their past behavior, and that in itself might increase their likelihood to repeat it. Giving people control is very important, and the perception that I have control could really influence my decision to comply with your request. Foot in the door, you know this technique is you open up with a question that to which most people say yes to, and that opens the road to agreement and compliance with a follow-up request. And finally, conformity describes how our behavior is affected by whether other people are watching us. So we wanted to test whether that was true in a consent environment as well. So these factors are universal, and their effectiveness doesn't depend on demographics or the medium of delivery, so whether you manipulate them in a mail pack or an email. However, some of these factors or principles may be more relevant to specific audience. For example, existing donors may respond less to social proof messages just because they have their own behavior to judge from, and they don't need cues from other people so much. Now, we identified these 6 principles, and there may be others as well that are relevant to this issue. But still, all this is very theoretical. So, okay, social proof works, but how do we use it in action? So what we need to do is translate these principles into statements, copy, or images that they can convey the message. And the execution of these principles, or creating versions to convey this message, is of very significant importance, because minor differences in the wording can result in significant differences in donor preference. So for example, with social proof, these are the versions that we created in our research last year with City University, and we had other people like you receive more information about us, other people like you in your region, thousands of people like you, 70% of people like you receive more information about us. We don't know which one is more effective, and there may be other versions that exist out there that we didn't include. However, as I said, these very minor differences can lead to significant differences in preference. And here are the results from our research. And you can see all the versions of social proof. This was the control to compare against. And in the yellow boxes, these are preference ratings. I'll explain a bit later on how we arrive at these, but what you need to know now is that these go up to 100. Obviously, the higher the rating, the higher the preference, but also they show magnitude. So a rating of 60 is twice as preferred as a rating of 30. So you can see here that minor differences in the wording can lead to a vast difference in preference. They go from 67 down to 37, and the difference was like 3 or 4 words. And the same was true for our social label principle, where the differences here again are dramatic. It goes up from 79 preference down to 31. and the difference was 1 or 2 words. So all this is to say that the things that you need to do is, first of all, identify which principles are relevant to your specific needs and audiences, but then you also need to come up with versions of these principles, a way to execute them into statements and see which ones are most effective. So how can you do that? Right, our process is pretty standard. We put learnings into action, we use a valid and robust methodology, and this way our results are highly applicable. However, there is one critical stage in this process that makes all the difference. We start with a black box. This represents the knowledge and experience we possess. Well, actually, I think it represents my 6 years of PhD because it felt as if I was locked in a black box. But right now, I'm out of it, and I have that knowledge, and that means I can access it quickly, and I can find what is relevant for a specific issue that could be applied and make a difference. And in this case, it's finding the behavioral science principles that matter for your audience. And next, we can create versions of these principles as we did with social proof, as you've seen. And then we can test thousands of these versions at the same time and then apply this learning to live testing. But once again, all this is very theoretical. So let me be a bit more specific about the testing process. The first stage is what I call the insight generation stage. The goal here is to determine the top performing behavioral principles for your audience and find the most effective versions of them, executions of them. And then the winning ones will be tested live. So as I said, much of the groundwork on identify the key behavioral principles has already been completed by our past research. And you can see here a short list of the most effective ones. However, the principles that are more important to you might differ depending on your unique organizational goals and audiences. And this is why there needs to be a literature review and of the literature, but also our past findings to identify the principles that will serve your needs best. And once we're able to do this, then we can fill in this testing grid, which represents all the principles that we want to test. This is the first column. These are all the behavioral science principles. And then within each row, you can see versions of each of that principle to see what's the best way to convey that message. Now, our pretest tool allows us to test each version against each other. And in the end, it will tell us not only which principle is most important, but also for each principle, which version is most effective. Now, this table here represents about 40,000 A/B tests. And the beauty of this is that we can run these 40,000 A/B tests at the same time in a framework of a week, a couple of weeks. And that's because what the pretest tool does is it combines each cell with every other cell to create communications. And once all possible combination has been made and all possible communications have been created, what the pretest tool does is presents people with a choice. We show people 2 different communications that combine different principles and different versions of principles, and we ask them to pick the one they prefer. And each person has to make a number of choices. In our past research, they had to make 12 such choices. And in the background, there was a complicated analysis run that could then inform us by the end of it which principles matter and which versions matter. So by the end, we had this ranking order of principles that were important. As you can see, number 1 was the idea that people have control. And also we could see which versions of these principles were the most important, were the most effective. You can read the full study and results by clicking on the link that I have here. This is to demonstrate the type of results that we had before, but also I need to stress that the order of these principles might differ for your charity because you have different audiences, different needs, and the versions of the principles that are most effective also might be different, also because you might want to include another version that wasn't included in here. So once this stage is completed, this means that we go from the 1,000 possible A/B tests down to a short list of ideas that are more manageable, like 5 or 10 ideas that we can test live. And this is more manageable, as I said, but also it increases chances of success because these were the winning principal versions. So now that we have an idea of what works, we can start creating consent communication where we have the principal in and out and test these communications simultaneously at different channels because, as I said, it doesn't matter where you use these behavioral science principles, they work across the board, and capture actual opt-in rates. Right. In the remaining time, I'd like to present a case study where we applied this test methodology. We worked with Crisis. We were very kind to let us share their results with you. The testing is not completed yet, but we just completed the first stage. Just a quick recap what the testing program entailed. During the first stage, what we tried to do is find the principles that work best for crisis. That meant we reviewed the literature to find the principles that were unique for their needs and audience. We tailored these principle versions, created executions according to the brand messaging. We filled in that complicated testing grid that you've seen before, and then we ran the test and we arrived at a short list of principal versions and executions that we should test live. And then the second stage entails the development of the test conditions and design, creating briefs for these communications, supervising the creation to make sure that the effect of the principle is not affected. And then, of course, live testing, analysis, and finally, arrival at the optimum consent communication. Now, so far, we've completed the first stage with Crisis, and these are the results I'm going to share with you. So during the kickoff meeting, we wanted to decide what we want to include in that complicated table, the testing grid. Obviously, we wanted to include the previous knowledge from the previous results that we had, and we also wanted to build on that. We wanted to include new principles that were relevant to crisis, but also we wanted to include ideas that crisis wanted to test. So by the end of our session, we came up with this grid, and again, the first column represents the principles that we want to test. The first one, the first row, the headline is not a behavioral science principle. This represented an idea that Crisis wanted to test, and most of you will recognize the infamous "your tick can do X." In this case, your tick can end homelessness, and we can only do what we do because of supporters like you, to signify the importance of supporters. And the rest were behavioral science principles. Commitment consistency was used again, but this time the versions, the executions are adapted to reflect the brand and messages that Crisis uses in their communications. Identity is all about why people decide to give to a specific charity. We said that the connection that someone has with a cause could be an important reason, and reminding them of that could lead to increased consent rates. Crisis also had a couple of hypotheses on why people give. One of them was a responsibility towards homeless people. The other was the belief that anyone could become homeless. So we added these two in the grid to test them. Transparency, it's a new principle again, and it's the idea that people respond to honesty and transparency. And we had two versions. The first one focused on the new privacy regulations being a major problem for Crisis. The second one repeated this, but it started with the supporters angle, that this could also be an opportunity for you to reduce unwanted communications. Labeling was an old principle, but again, we adapted the versions and the executions to reflect language that Crisis is using. Foot in the door, again, same deal here. It's an old principle, but we adapted it for Crisis. Conformity is the use of an image. And control, in our previous test, we found that channel control beats control over frequency, because we offered people the choice between choosing channel and choice between choosing how often they'd like to receive communications. So this time we wanted to see whether control over content would make a bigger difference. Crisis current statement offers channel control. So we added that and we compared it against two other options. The first one offered people control over the frequency of donations, them being regular, occasional, once, or never want to hear from Crisis ever again. And the second one offered the same options, but also it offered the opportunity for people to give up their time, to volunteer, fundraise, campaign, and so forth. And this is based on academic findings where when you ask people to donate and give up their time, and then you ask them to donate money, then they're more willing to donate. So we added all this in the mix, and then, as I said, the pretest tool combines each cell with every other to create communications. And here's an example of two communications, and people had to make a choice which they prefer. We asked 330 donors, existing donors, and this meant that basically we could test 5,296 packages against each other. Let's look into detail into one of these results, the perceived control, which is the most important in my view. As I said, we offered control over how often they'd like to donate, channel control, which was the statement that Crisis is using, and control over content, to hear opportunities to volunteer, fundraise, campaign, and donations. As you can see here, the content, or as we call it, the time ask, opportunity to give up your time and donate, was the most preferred, and it beat control over channel. This is the first time that we found something that beats control over channel, which is very promising because it gives us more room and gives us more ideas to test live. The next stage is to take this, test it live, and test the combination of channel maybe and content and other options. And here are the overall results. Now, the first thing you see, everything in bold is the winner in that row. So you can see that in the headline, mentioning that your ticket and homelessness is actually worse than saying nothing. The same was true for the other headline. Commitment, consistency, people preferred a more simple wording, thank you for supporting Crisis in the past, instead of the more elaborate brand messages that Crisis is using. In terms of identity, people really liked reminding them that if they have a connection to the cause. The other hypothesis about responsibility or the belief that anyone could be homeless wasn't, they weren't as strong. Transparency statements were highly preferred, and actually the angle that with the supporters' needs and the opportunity to reduce unwanted communications was the most preferred. When it comes to labels, in our previous research, being a supporter was a winner, but in this case, we can see that using a more specific to the charity wording can make a difference. Here, the winner was, you're someone who cares about homeless people. Foot in the door, our previous winner was, would you like to know how your money is used? Here, we replicated this result, but the difference you make was also equally preferred. The perceived control, we went through that in the previous slide, and conformity, we used different images that gave us different ideas on what might affect people's choices that we can then move to a testing environment. And here is the relative importance of the principles. The three most important is perceived control, conformity, which is the presence of an image, the transparent statements, and then the rest followed, using labels, asking people how their money is used, reminding them of past behavior, the identity, and last was the tick to end homelessness headline. Just to, I should stress at this point that we measured preference at this stage, but preference and behavior might sometimes be at odds with each other. For example, transparent statements are highly preferred, but whether that would increase consent rates, it remains to be seen. It might increase consent rates, but It might also remind people that they can opt out, and it might decrease them, which is why it's important to move from this insight generation stage, which gives you a hint of what might work, to a live testing environment. And that's where we are at the moment with Crisis. We prepare the communications and we advise on how to best use the winning principles in those communications in and out to test for and capture actual opt-in rates. The first one will go out in July and the rest will follow until the end of the year. So hopefully soon enough I'll have more results to share with you. So in a nutshell, by following this type of procedure, there is a higher chance of decreasing the number of donors you lose because of a scientific and evidence-based approach. You are using behavioral science principles that are tailored to your audience and brand, and more importantly, you pre-test everything. So you pre-test thousands of combinations before you risk going live with it. There's minimal time resources from you, and it offers a long-term solution that could be applied across the board, whether you go opt-in or opt-out. So whatever you do right now, doing nothing is not an option because GDPR is around the corner. And you just need to remember that how we ask people to opt in or opt out will have a direct impact on the number of people that choose to stay or leave. And at this point, I'd open to questions, anything that you want me to explain more or any objections, happy to hear. Right. The first question is, you've also altered fonts in your test materials. Does that have a bearing also? Good spot, first of all, great observation skills. That was another principle that we added in the test that we did 1 year ago. It does, we expect it to affect results. However, obviously the idea behind it is that if you use a slightly harder to read font, people will slow down, take in the information, and that might affect their choice. However, the reason we didn't include it in this round of testing with Crisis is because obviously if you ask people which font they prefer, they will always prefer the easy to read font. The crucial information is to test this live and to see if you use a more difficult to read font live will affect the actual opt-in rates. So yes, we expect it to have a bearing, and it's one of the ideas that we're going to test with Crisis in the second stage of this project. The second question, what audiences are used for the testing? With Crisis, we used their existing donor base, and as I said, we only needed like about 300 existing donors. There is the option to add a panel, and we can filter them in order to match your prospects, and that would give us an idea of what they might prefer and if their preferences are different to existing donors. However, from past experience, we don't expect so much difference between existing and new donors as much as compared to the identities that they bring to the party, which is a whole other discussion. But it is possible to include more than one audience. The third question, in the UK, we have to provide options over channel and over opportunity. When do we end up with too many options? That's a great question, and that's why it's important to test this incrementally. Obviously, any type of control is better than not giving any. About channel, I wonder whether you have to offer it all at once or whether it'd be better, or I don't even know if it's possible, but if it'd be possible to offer channel control with every type of communication you send out, that might be ideal. So if you send an email, you ask consent for email. If you send a direct mail, you ask consent for a direct mail. And this is because there are context effects that might influence people's choice. And if I see a list of mail, email, telephone, I might tick on email because that's the most convenient for me, and then I don't tick anything else. So for channel, there might be another way to tackle it if possible. In terms of how many is too many, I don't have the answer, but I know how to find the answer, and that's by testing incrementally and adding a number of choices into your communications. Right. Who did you do the pre-testing on at Crisis? Was it their active supporters? Yes, that's correct. That was their existing supporters. But as I mentioned, we have the option to add prospects as well. Would your advice be any different for a smaller charity with few current donors to live test? Yeah, that's a challenge if there isn't much room for live testing. However, because of the flexibility with behavioral science principles could be applied to anything with different channels, that might help. No, the process would be the same. We might change the tactics to adapt it. Have you tested on corporate supporters, different levels of employee, or communicating through workplace channels, i.e. LinkedIn or internal communication, or is there any research on this? That's a good question. No, I haven't looked into that. Happy to look into that and get back to you. I don't know how we're doing on time or if it's time to move on. I think I should hand over back to Casper, but I promise I will look at all these questions, so please feel free to send your questions until the end of the webinar, and I'll respond in writing to all of them. Thank you very much.
Super, thank you so much, Kiki. That's absolutely fascinating stuff. And yeah, we've got loads and loads of questions coming through, which is brilliant. And we will do our best to answer all those and circulate the answers afterwards. Thank you, Kiki. There's undoubtedly a lot of perceived fear, uncertainty and doubt around GDPR right now. And yes, it's important, we all need to get it right. But more than anything, I think there's an opportunity here to improve the donor experience and grow fundraising at the same time. And I absolutely love the research-led approach that Kiki and Donor Voice have taken to figuring out what that looks like. In a similar vein, the one thing we at Blackboard want to do is to help provide clarity and not to add to the perceived fear around GDPR. So what we've done is created a GDPR hub on our microsite. You can see the link on the screen there. We're updating that with new materials every week or two, and all of our materials are validated by our own internal legal counsel, who is qualified in data privacy, and she's our own data protection officer here to make sure we get it right and that we're only saying things that you can rely on. So I'd highly encourage you to go and take a look at our hub if there's anything around GDPR or consent that you're not clear on, and to keep coming back. And I know that many of you listening are Blackboard customers, of course, likely using one of our CRM solutions, and I have no doubt that you'll be extremely keen to hear how we're developing those products over the next few months to accommodate GDPR and opt-in consent. So I'd like to warmly invite you to one of our series of webinars that we're running early next month explaining exactly that. You can come to our website to register, and also the link will be on the slides on the follow-up email that's sent out after this webinar. So all that remains is for me once more to thank Kiki again and our friends at Donor Voice for their time and in sharing their fascinating research with us, and of course to thank all of you listening in. We've had over 300 on the line today, which is wonderful. Any questions we didn't get to, we will circulate the answers to in the follow-up email, along with the slides and along with the recording. And so with that, we bid all of you listening a very pleasant remainder of your Wednesday.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.